Today I'm going to be doing a part 3 to tier ranking every single book that I had read this past year. I'd done this for the first time back in April. I had tier ranked the first 80 or so books that I had read, everything from the beginning of the year up until April. And then in September, I had tier ranked everything from April until September. So I think it was 100 or so books that I had read more or less over the summer. And now we're going to pick up right where that September video had left off. And we're going to tier rank the rest of the books that I had read throughout the year. So if you did miss part 1 and part 2, I will have those videos linked down below for you. And then also because we have so many books to go through, I believe I have at least 70 or 80. I don't really know. I didn't really count. But my point is that that's a lot of books to go through. So I'm going to try my best to keep it short and simple and to the point and not actually go too deep into why I'm ranking something in a specific, tier rank. And also I'm not going to share with you what any of these books are actually about. And instead, I will have my wrap up playlist linked down below for you because all of these books I had read from the end of September up until today. So therefore, all of them have been talked about in great detail in all of my recent wrap up videos. So if you did want to hear a little bit more as to any of the books I'm talking about today, you can just go and deep dive a couple of videos that I had recently made. So with that said, let me share with you the tier ranks that we have today. So I have 5 different rankings. They're very straight up and to the point. DNF'd, literally did not finish the book. For whatever reason, it wasn't working out for me, so I put it down early. And then I shouldn't have wasted my time are books that I did make it to the end, but I wouldn't have minded if I DNF'd it because for whatever reason, I wasn't enjoying my time with it, even though I somehow read the entire thing. And then Met is very middle ground. There are things that I enjoyed about the book. There are also things that I wasn't really enjoying about the book, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend these books to just anybody, but in certain circumstances, I feel it could be a recommendation that I would end up giving out. And then Enjoyed It a Lot was a very solid time. I had a great time with it, didn't absolutely love it, but it didn't suck in a ton of different ways, And then Loved It is Loved It. So these are not necessarily 1 to 5 star ratings. I don't even remember what I had rated all of these books in the moment that I read them. I'm going off with how I feel about them right now, and I'm not necessarily thinking of these 5 different tier ranks as 1 to 5 stars. I'm thinking of them of exactly how they're written down as. So with that information out of the way, let's get into tier ranking. So first up, we have Josh and Hazel's Guide to Not Dating by Christina Lauren. So this was actually a reread for me. And not only was it a reread, it was a second round of rereading it this past year. So I probably talked about this in another one of my tier ranking videos that I made this year. But either way, obviously it's going on Loved It because I've read it 3 or 4 times now and it's just as good every single time. And then next up, we have The Fox and the Hound by R.S. Grace. So this was a reread for me as well. I did just talk about this in my last video, which was literally all the books that I had reread this past year. But either way, I'm going to put this one on Enjoyed It a Lot because I didn't enjoy it as much this second time around as I did the first time. But the first time that I read it, I didn't even absolutely love it. It was a really solid time. Second time around, it was still a really solid time, but just a little bit less of a really solid time. So it deserves to go on Enjoyed It a Lot because it was a solid reread. And then Boss Man was another reread, and I absolutely loved it this second time around. It was one of my favorite books from last year, still just as good when I went back to it. And then A Nordic King. So this is a book that I specifically remember giving 5 stars in the moment, but I feel after the fact, it wasn't it doesn't deserve necessarily to sit with the rest of my 5-star books, even though I really did have a great time with it in the moment that I read it. So I'm going to put it on Enjoyed It a Lot because it was a really, really solid book and I loved it in the moment. But after the fact, my enjoyment for it went down just a little bit. It wasn't as memorable or it doesn't really stay in my brain as oh my God, this was such an amazing book, but it really was a solid time in the moment that I read it. So it deserves to be there. Anyway, next up, Meet You in the Middle was another reread for me and it was just as good the second time around. So it definitely deserves to go on Loved It. And then Twice Shy. This is a book that was sitting on my TBR forever and I'm so happy that I finally can cross it off my list. And it ended up being a little bit meh for me. It was a solid book, but I don't think I was the reader that was meant to read it. It just wasn't so much for me. And I didn't love everything about it, but it was such a short, quick, easy read that I'm not upset that I decided to pick it up, Anyway, next up, Forbidden. So this was actually a reread for me. I think I read this for the first time in April or so. So it was probably in the first tier ranking video that I made this year. But either way, loved it the second time around. So it's going on Loved It. And then Catching Cadence. So this was a book that I was thinking about reading for a while. I kept going back and forth. I would see a review here that would make me want to read. And then I'd see another review that kind of convinced me that I didn't really want to read it. And then I went to Book Bonanza and I met the author and I decided to just purchase the book very in the moment. And then I brought it home and then I was going to a baseball game like the next day, and this is a baseball book. So I'm like, you know what? Why don't I pick it up and read it just to get myself into the baseball mood? So I'm happy that I had read it to get myself into that vibe, but I didn't enjoy the book, and I wouldn't have minded if I never read it. So I'm putting it on I shouldn't have wasted my time, because I know that I made it to the end of this book, but if I DNF'd it, I don't think I would have been missing out on anything, because there was a lot about it that I didn't like. So I should have listened to myself originally when I told myself that I probably shouldn't read it, and then I met the author, so I don't really mind, like, you know, that I gave it a shot, but either way, didn't work out for me. So that was a fun story time. Anyway, The Devil You Know, this is, I believe, the second book in her Devil's Companion series by Elizabeth O'Rourke, and I enjoyed this book a lot. I've enjoyed all of the books in the series, and this next one is the third one in the series, and this one I absolutely loved. Like, I'm pretty sure I loved the first one, liked the second one, and then loved the third one. So that's why it's going there. But either way, the first one I had read, you know, a couple of months ago, so I don't remember what tier ranking it was in, but I remember putting that first one on, loved it, and I still would put it on love it even like after the fact. So anyway, that is how I am ranking those two books. And then next up is Triple Duty Bodyguard. So this book I shouldn't have wasted my time with. I had read this on Kindle Unlimited because I had read another book by this author like in the past, and I did enjoy it. It's a reverse harem, so it's like you gotta be in the mood to read it. And I liked the first one. This one very much did not work out for me though. And I don't even remember how I made it to the end. Like, I feel like I DNF'd it, but I know that I read the whole thing. So either way, shouldn't have wasted my time with it. And then next up is Give Me More. So this book I'm putting on enjoyed it a lot. And I remember specifically in the moment, I absolutely loved it. But after the fact, those feelings kind of like dwindled down a little bit. And now I just think of it as like a really solid time. Like, it's something I feel like I would revisit in the future, but I didn't like absolutely love it. And it's not going to make it onto like my favorite reads of 2022. It was a good book. So it's going to go there. Anyway, next up, I have the 5 books in the Broken Bond series. So I went into this series with very high hopes. The 6th book was about to come out, so I'm like, you know what, perfect time to read it. Let's get through all 5 books so that by the time the 6th book comes out, I will be all caught up. So I binged all 5 of them, and they just got worse and worse as I kept going. I had so much to say about all of these books, so I went into like very great detail in my Goodreads reviews and when I talked about them in my wrap up, so I won't do it again here. But either way, I wouldn't necessarily recommend this series. Only to like, you know, a handful of people that I think it would work for, but it was just not good for me. So I'm saying that I'm not recommending them, and I'm saying that before I actually rank them because of where I'm actually going to put them. So I remember the first book I did enjoy a lot. Like, I had some issues with it, but I was like, you know what, I see the potential, so I'm going to keep going. And then the second book, I feel like it was a solid time. Like, you know, I started to see a little bit more of the issues. A lot of the things that I wanted to see get fixed wasn't really getting fixed. So like, you know, I didn't love it as much as the first one, but I kept going. So then the next book, I feel like it was meant to, even though I can't really remember like the specific details of what started and what ended between each book, but either way, I feel like the first 3 books or so, I was still hanging on, hoping for the best sort of thing. And then the next book, I shouldn't have wasted my time with, because I was just like, I was forcing myself through at that point. I was seeing through the plot, and I'm like, this is just not going to go where I wanted it to go. And then the last book, I actually DNF'd, and then I never even made it to the 6th book. I don't even remember at what point I gave up in the 5th one, but I'm like, you know what? I spent so much time on this series, and I just know I'm going to be disappointed by the end of it. It's not what I wanted it to be, so I'm just going to give up here, even though I spent all that time trying to get through the first 5 books. So that is how I feel about the Broken Bond series. I feel like I would have put all 5 of these books on I shouldn't have wasted my time, and then like, you know, the one on the DNF, but I'm going to be nice there, because in the moment that I read them, that is more or less like how I feel about it. You know, like my enjoyment just like very quickly dwindled as I got later and later into the series. So that is that. Next up is Heartless by Elsie Silver. So I'm not sure if I should put this on enjoyed it a lot or if I should put it on met, because I feel like it was very in between the two. I don't think that it sucked enough to actually deserve to go on met, but also I didn't necessarily enjoy it a ton. I feel like it was a very like 3.5 stars sort of book for me. So it's like, do I want to be nice and like bump it up, or do I want to be mean and bump it down? And I'm feeling like being mean and bumping it down, but I do know that a lot of people absolutely love this book, and I feel like it possibly should be on enjoyed it a lot, but this is my tier ranking. So at the end of the day, I do feel quite meh about it, so we're just gonna put it there. Anyway, next up is Icebreaker. I had DNF'd this book halfway through. I know a lot of people loved it. It was a very hyped up book. Did not work out for me. Gave up on it 50% in, and honestly, I feel like I even shouldn't have wasted my time getting 50% through. Should have DNF'd it right away, because I felt that it wasn't working out for me, but somehow I pushed through and then I eventually gave up. Next up is Meet Me Halfway. So unfortunately, I had actually read this book right after I had done a reread of Wait for It by Marianne Romance Pata. And this was a new release at the time that I was reading it, so Wait for It had come first. And I just kept seeing way too many similarities between the two books that Meet Me Halfway was really pissing me off. Like, I would get to a scene and I'm like, I just read this scene. Like, where did I read this scene? Oh yeah, in Wait for It. And it's like, all the characters were very similar. A lot of the scenes were similar. A lot of the details about the scenes and about the characters were very similar, like left and right. And it was just like a worse version of Wait for It for me. So therefore, I wish that I didn't waste my time with it, because I just kept getting more upset and more upset that it felt like it was just like copying Wait for It. And therefore, I really didn't enjoy my time with it. I think like by itself, if you never read Wait for It, it might be a good time. But like if you wanted like a really, really solid book and you were interested in this book, I would say just go for Wait for It, because I feel like this author had just like copied that book and she didn't do as good of a job with it. So whatever, I said what I said. Anyway, next up is Home Game. I had DNF'd this book pretty early on. For so many reasons, it just wasn't working out for me. So I just put it down early. And then Marriage for One, I feel like I enjoy this book a lot. I had read it via audio and I was very like 50-50 going into it. I went into it with no expectations because I had seen so many really amazing reviews, and then I had seen a lot of reviews being like, oh, this is not worth anybody's time. So that's why I had read it via audio. And then I think because I read it via audio specifically, I ended up really enjoying it. I think that if I would have read it with my eyes, I wouldn't have liked it as much. But because of the format in which I read it, I honestly had a pretty solid time with it. So putting it on, enjoyed it a lot. And then Tattered, I feel like I was very mad about this book. Honestly, it was like pretty forgettable. It was pretty basic, very simple, exactly what I expected it to be. Didn't really surprise me, but also it didn't really like disappoint me. So feel like it deserves to be very in the middle. Anyway, next up is King of Wrath. I really enjoyed this book at the time that I read it. I feel like it deserves to go on love, but honestly, like after the fact, maybe should I put it on enjoyed it a lot, because I literally I enjoyed it a lot. Like I wasn't obsessed with it, but it was a good time. So you know what? Yeah, it deserves to be on enjoyed it a lot, because I loved it in the moment, but after the fact, just enjoyed it a lot, you know? Anyway, next up is The Soulmate Equation. I had done a reread of this and I really loved reading it the second time around, just as good as the first. So putting it on loved. And then A Fate of Wrath and Flame, I wish I didn't waste my time with. And then the second book, I DNF it? I don't believe I DNF'd it, but shouldn't have wasted my time with it either. So I was really pushing myself through these books. Like I was like, you know what? I see the potential. Let me just get through it. I feel like, you know, I just got to get myself into it. And then I kept feeling that way. And then it would disappoint me here, it would disappoint me there. And then basically I just like, you know, I just didn't really care for it by the time I got to the end of book 2. So, you know, shouldn't have wasted my time. Anyway, next up, I had done a reread of the first 4 books in the ACOTAR series. I had done a reread of it earlier this year, and then I had done A Quarter of Silver Flames as well, so I had read like all 5 books, and then I very randomly got the urge to like do another reread of it this year, so I just ended up doing like Face Hand Stories. So obviously, I absolutely loved all 4 books. I honestly can like go and start doing a reread of it again. I'm not going to, but you know, I love it that much that I wouldn't mind picking these books up at literally like any time in my life. So anyway, next up is Hate, Liar, and Fake. So how did I feel about this book? I feel like the first book was a little bit mad. Like I was kind of like pushing myself through it, being like, okay, let me get into it. I know that this is a 4-book series, so like, you know, first books sometimes are not the best, but I was very like mad about it. Mad enough though to continue going. And then I feel like the second and then the third book I shouldn't have wasted my time with. And I actually ended up DNFing the series after book 3 because it just kept repeating itself. I kept just like not really being into it. And I'm like, I wish that there was a little bit more to the plot line. And it's like, I just like, I don't know, it was like just a reverse harem story, but like I wasn't even like absolutely loving everything about it. So, you know, that's how I feel about it. Anyway, next up is Hate Notes. I feel like this book was very meta. Like it was a solid time. I think I read it via audio and via ebook. Like I was going back and forth between the two. And I feel like it was an okay way to spend my time, but it wasn't anything like extraordinary. Like I would recommend this book to specific people, like at specific times, but it wasn't something that like I thought about after I finished it, you know? Anyway, next up is Haunting Adeline. I did DNF this around halfway through. It just wasn't for me, so I just, you know, I gave up early. And then Vicious was a reread for me. I obviously absolutely loved it because it was the third time that I read this book. I read it twice this year, and I'd read it once the year before. Love that book so much. And then Down Comes the Night. I feel like I enjoyed this book a lot in the moment. It was one of those books I was just like sitting on my TBR forever, and I'm like, I really want to get this off of my TBR. And I had read it around October time because it was a very like moody, atmospheric sort of book. So I'm like, let me read it while the vibes are there. And then I really ended up enjoying it more than I expected to. So I feel like it deserves to be on enjoyed it a lot. Anyway, next up On the Fence was very meh for me. So this was another book that I had read because it was on my TBR for a very long time. It was YA, and it kind of just like got stuck there because I slowly grew out of YA, but I didn't really get through all of the books that I had on my physical TBR before that actually happened. So this past year, I tried reading this book via audio, and it was an okay time. Wasn't anything special. I feel like if I read it when I was like 12 years old, it would have been a lot better. But either way, it was a fine way to spend my time in the moment that I read it. So very meh. And then it happened one summer. I feel like I was very meh about this book, and then also hook, line, and sinker, I was very meh. Like, I see why people liked it. I wasn't one of the people who absolutely loved it, but it wasn't as bad as I expected it to be. So I feel like it deserves to be very much in the middle. And then anyway, next up is Savage Land. So I shouldn't have wasted my time with this. I read through the whole first book, but then I DNF'd the series after the fact because I just knew that the series, it wasn't going to work out for me. Just the same way that, the entire Broken Bond series was feeling. I feel like Savage Lands had the same thing where it's it's just going to let me down for this and this reason. The writing just isn't up to par, and the building of the world and the storyline and everything like that, it's going to end up bothering me later on. So after book one, even though I liked the idea of the story, I decided to just give up because it was just going to frustrate me if I just kept on reading. I knew it was going to happen. So I gave up, after book one. So shouldn't have wasted my time with book one because, it didn't end up getting me anywhere. Anyway, next up is Mine Would Be You. So I enjoyed this book a lot. Didn't absolutely love it, but think that it was a really solid time, and honestly would recommend it to anybody who is interested in, the actual synopsis of the story. And then a spoiler alert, I shouldn't have wasted my time on it. And funny story is that I actually had owned this book for a very long time. And at one point in this year, I was really trying to take a couple of books off of my physical TBR. So I'm you know what, let me read this book. And I had actually read it via audio because I'm you know what, I don't really want to read it with my eyes. Let's just, get it out of the way via audio. And it wasn't the worst time in the world, but honestly, I just really shouldn't have wasted my time with it. And then after the fact, I actually realized that I even had unhauled this book at one point because, I just knew I was never going to get to it. But in my head at the time that I was reading the book, I didn't remember that I unhauled it. So I was thinking that I was getting it off my physical TBR, but it was already off my physical TBR. And I should have thought about that because I knew myself that I wasn't going to enjoy it. So I really shouldn't have wasted my time with it because the only reason I was reading it was to get it off my TBR, and it was already off my TBR. You get the circle? Anyway, it was a very funny story. So I just wanted to share. Anyway, next up is Quarterback Sneak. I absolutely loved this book. It was probably my favorite book by Candy Steiner, and I've read a lot of Candy Steiner this past year, so that is saying something. Really had a great time with that. And then Torn by Carrie Ann Cole. I enjoyed this book a lot. I did not expect to enjoy this book as much as I did, but just the way that the author went about writing the actual storyline ended up making me really enjoy it. So I was honestly blown away by it. Didn't love it to death, but I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected to. So putting it there. And then Always Only You, I had DNF'd this book probably halfway through, or maybe even a little bit more than halfway through. I just was not vibing with anything about the story, wasn't into it, and really just didn't want to spend any more of my time on it. So I gave up on it. And then the X-Hex was very meh for me. Honestly, I didn't think I was going to enjoy this book as much as I did. I thought for some reason I was like, let me just read it because it's it was Halloween time. I want to read a book about witches. This was the one that was available. So I just, gave it a shot, but I didn't think I was going to enjoy it. And then I ended up having a better time with it than I thought I was going to, but I still didn't love it. It was still very meh, but I really went into the book thinking that I'm wasting my time with this. And then it ended up being a little bit pleasantly surprised. It reminded me of a Sabrina the Teenage Witch episode, and that's kind of why I liked it. It kind of was just it had a vibe to it, and I enjoyed the vibe in the moment, but it wasn't the best book in the world. So whatever. Anyway, very mid. And then next up is Play With Me, and I was very mad about this book. Honestly, it disappointed me a little bit. I think it was a good time. This is one of those ones where I feel it deserves to go in between meh and enjoyed it a lot, but there's not a ranking for that. So we're just gonna have to be a little bit critical and put it on meh. I loved the first book in this series, and this one, it just didn't feel the same. There was just so much more about it that ended up getting me bored, and I just I wasn't as into it as the first book, and therefore I was just very about it. I wouldn't have minded if I didn't read it, but I did read it, so whatever. It is what it is. Next up is Tapping the Billionaire, and I actually DNF'd this book probably around halfway through. It started off pretty solid. I had high hopes for it, and then it just went downhill really quickly. Once the sex started kicking in, poof, no longer cared about it, so DNF'd it. And then A Risk on Forever, I honestly feel I shouldn't have wasted my time with it. I feel in the moment that I read it, I would have put it on very meh, it was meh, but after the fact, I'm nah, I kind of pushed myself through that book. I really didn't care. I was trying to care because I had heard such good things about it, but it just really wasn't for me, and I didn't really love it. So wish I didn't waste my time on that one. And then The Deal was a reread for me, and I absolutely loved it, as well as The Chase. So those are two books from the Off Campus series. Really really big fan of the off-campus series, and those were really great times when I went and revisited them. And then Mine for Yours was a DNF for me. Really wasn't vibing with the writing style, wasn't really enjoying the storyline or anything like that, so gave up on it pretty early. And then The Hayden Game, this was a reread for me, and unfortunately, it did disappoint me the second time around. So I really wish that I didn't waste my time in it. I wish that I just never revisited the story, so I could have looked back on the book with very fond memories. And now that I reread it, I don't enjoy, I can't look at it and enjoy it as much as I used to enjoy it. So I really wish that I didn't reread it and everything like that. But unfortunately I did, so that's now how I feel about it. Next up is Roomies. I had DNF'd this book. I don't even remember how far in. I was trying to get myself into it, really wasn't enjoying the storyline. There was so much about it that just was not working for me, so I gave up on it early. And then Arrogant Devil, I enjoyed this book a lot. I feel like maybe it could go on meh, but at the end of the day, it's I feel like there was a solid amount of time that I was enjoying it, so I'm just gonna put it on enjoyed a lot. This one is one I think I'm being a little bit nice for, but it's fine. We could be nice sometimes. And then Flirt, I did end up DNFing. And then this next book by Catherine Cowles is a book that technically I had DNF'd, but I had DNF'd it at literally the 95% mark because I had actually gotten a faulty copy of it, and therefore the last little bit had blank pages, so I wasn't even able to finish it if I wanted to. But fortunately, I wasn't actually enjoying the book, so I didn't really care that I couldn't get the last couple of details at the end of the story. So I'm going to put this one at, I shouldn't have wasted my time. Honestly, I am a fan of Catherine Cowles. I do like her books in general, but this one just didn't really hit the mark for me, and I didn't technically even finish it, but I'm not considering it a DNF because technically I made it basically to the end. I just didn't see more or less the epilogue and the last chapter of the book, so it's fine. But really, I shouldn't have wasted my time with it because I wasn't really very much into it. And then this next book, I shouldn't have wasted my time with. So I actually went into this story not realizing that it was an accidental pregnancy story, but it was a very classic accidental pregnancy story. And I ended up reading through the whole thing because I just I had nothing better to do. So I'm you know what? I started it. Let's just see it through. Maybe it will surprise me. Didn't end up surprising me. It was a classic accidental pregnancy story, and I'm not really a fan of accidental pregnancies, so I really wish that I didn't waste my time on it. But unfortunately, I did. And then next up, Letters to Molly, I absolutely loved. This is a second chance romance, and I had a feeling I would like it, even though I'm not usually a fan of second chance romances, and I'm very happy that I gave it a shot because I ended up absolutely loving it. I had a feeling that this was going to be an exception for me, and it ended up being an exception. So I am happy that I decided to pick that one up. And then Love Light Farms, I absolutely loved. This is actually the only Christmas book that I had read this past year, and I was blown away by it. I was just obsessed with it from the first chapter. Didn't want to put it down the entire time. I was just super into that story, and it really ended up blowing me away. I did not expect to enjoy that book as much as I did, so I'm very happy that I ended up picking it up. Next up is the Remnant Chronicles series. So this is, I believe, a YA series, and I don't know, it's just a fantasy of sorts. And I had read it via audio because I had them on my physical TBR forever, and I really wanted to get them off. I knew I wasn't going to read them with my eyes, so instead I just read them via audio, and I really did enjoy my time with it. The thing is that the first book I was very mad about because there were so many characters that you were following, so I had a very hard time keeping track of who is who and whose eyes we're seeing out of because I was reading it via audio. And I think that's a little bit of a fault on my end because if I would have read it with my eyes, I might not have had as hard of a time following along with the story because I would have been able to see the actual names of each of the characters and everything like that. But whatever, that's how I read it, and that's how I felt about it. And then the second book ended up being better, and therefore I feel I enjoyed it a lot because I finally started to get used to all of the characters and where we're at in the storyline. So everything started clicking much easier, and it started to be a pretty solid time. And then I happen to have really loved the third book. I was finally officially into all of the characters. I was really rooting for them, really into the storyline. So I was enjoying it at that time. And then the last book I was a little bit mad about. I don't know, I just feel it was one of those books that was it was ending the story. It was a fine way to end the story, but I wasn't obsessed with it. I'm okay, let's get this over with. Yeah, we're just figuring out the nitty-gritty details so that all of this can end. And it was what it was, but I wasn't as obsessed with it as I was the book before. So I ended up feeling just very mad about it by the end of it. But I think overall, the series as a whole would go on and enjoy it a lot. So, I'm just saying it's a series that's worth reading, but that's how I felt about each book individually. And then next up is Tempt by Melanie Harlow. And I am going to be putting this book on I Shouldn't Have Wasted My Time because I really didn't enjoy my time reading it. I seriously wouldn't have minded if I had DNF'd it, but somehow I made it to the end because I was just I was this amount curious of is it going to actually surprise me or not? Didn't end up surprising me me ended up being like super predictable, super classic, everything along those lines. And I just wasn't really impressed. And honestly, I was bored for the majority of the time that I was reading it. So wish that I didn't waste my time on it, but I didn't end up DNFing it. So whatever, it deserves to go there. And then lastly, we have all my Mariana's Potter books. So we're actually going to jump to this last one, When Gracie Met the Grump. I actually DNF'd this book not even halfway through. I honestly can't remember exactly where I DNF'd it, but unfortunately it wasn't working out for me. And that was just so sad because Mariana's Potter is one of my favorite authors of all time. And this was her newest release. And I couldn't get myself into it. Like it was a little bit different than her usual work. And I just really wasn't vibing with it. So I ended up DNFing it. And then the rest of these are all rereads. So I obviously absolutely loved all of them. I actually had reread Wait for It twice, reread Luna and the Lie twice, and then Dear Aaron was a reread, The Wall of Winnipeg was a reread, and then From the Love of Love was a reread, and then Culty was a reread as well. So either way, that is all of the books that I had read from September up until more or less the end of December. So when I look at this, I feel like it does look pretty evenly spaced out. Like my largest section is Unloved It, but if you really look at it, the majority of those books were rereads for me. So I feel like, I didn't actually find that many new amazing books in the past couple of months, but there are a solid amount on Enjoyed It a lot. So I feel like that's at least something. And I am very happy that like my DNF section is as large as that. Not that I'm happy that like I read a lot of books that absolutely sucked, but I'm happy that I was able to see through it and not end up wasting my time with it, because there are a lot of books on this section of I wouldn't have minded if I DNF'd it, but like if only I had actually DNF'd a couple more of those, I would have not wasted as much of my time, but I didn't do that. So whatever, either way, there were a solid amount of books in the past couple of months that didn't really end up working out for me. But you know what? I feel like overall I've read almost 300 books this year, and not every book is going to be a banger. So I feel like, it's not as bad as it could have been. So either way, that is about it. That is all of the books that I have read this year, tier ranked, split up into 3 videos. So either way, if you enjoyed watching this video, then please give it a thumbs up if you liked it. Also subscribe to my channel if you're not currently subscribed, because I would really appreciate it. But either way, just thank you so much for watching my video, because I really appreciate that. And either way, with that said, until next time, enjoy reading.